Good afternoon, a bienvenue. I am Stephen Saidman, Director of the Canadian Defence and Security Network, and I'm also the Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton's Normerson Patterson School of International Affairs. Welcome to our second annual Capstone Seminar. The idea of the Capstone Seminar is to bring together some of the best presentations from our partners' events in the previous year. Last year, we held this event at the Canadian Forces College just as North America was about to shut down in response to the COVID crisis. This year, like the presentations themselves, we're all online. So one of the reasons we put this event together is that we want the Canadian Defence and Security Network to give greater visibility to all of our different events that our partners have organized across Canada and beyond, to help our partners and their participants have their events last longer than a day in some corner of Canada. As the director of the CDSN, it gives me great pride to see this event continue despite the challenging circumstances. The CDSN team has been terrific in these trying times. The co-directors across Canada have led to the 5 research teams and helped guide the network. Melissa Jennings, the Director of Communications, has promoted this event and will be posting the videos and slides on the CDSN YouTube channel afterwards. Stephanie Plant, our project coordinator, has worked with the AV people to deliver the conference. Our team of research assistants have been helping to set this thing up. And of course, I'm most grateful to the Capstone laureates for presenting their research today and their time with us. I wish I could give you the Capstone laureate plaques in person, along with feeding you with a dinner so that we could all meet each other in person. I had a great time last year. It was also a good networking event for the folks who were involved. Once we get beyond the quarantine, we will try to bring as many of you together as possible at a future CDSN event. We're also most grateful to the SHIRK Partnership Program for funding our staff and to Carleton for funding our graduate students for this project. Our presenters come from CDSN partners and networks funded by the Department of National Defense, the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security, the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research, North American and Arctic Defense Security Network, Project Plowshares, Military Design and Innovation Collaboration Network, the Defense and Security Innovation Hub, and our own CDSN postdoc. During the course of this afternoon's seminars, you should be able to post your questions via the Q&A feature as you watch. But if you cannot, send your questions to info@cdsn-rcds.com. That's info@cdsn-rcds.com. I will probably not live tweet this event as is my habit, but you can using the hashtag Capstone 2021. You can follow us all day at CDSN-RCDS on Twitter, and you can also follow that for all of our news and updates. Before concluding my introduction, I would like to ask that our audience keep an eye on in upcoming weeks on our CDSN webpage. That's www.cdsn-rcds.com, as we're launching a series of initiatives. Our next round of book workshops, our undergraduate excellence scholarship. We're going to have another rapid response conference to COVID, although it'll be a little bit less rapid since we'll be looking backwards at the past year. We'll also be having links to our Summer Institute. And of course, we have weekly or semi-weekly episodes of Battle Rhythm, alternating with Conseil de Sécurité, which is the Francophone podcast we also host. Finally, we want to acknowledge that while our Capstone 2021 is virtual, Carleton University is located on the unceded Algonquin territory, which is home to the Anishinaabe Nation. We will be providing simultaneous translation in French and English. If you have any technical problems, please reach out to Stephanie Plant. That's spelled Stephanie with a PH, Plant with an E, at cunet.carleton.ca. Our 2 undergraduate excellence scholars will introduce the 2 panels, and I will moderate the Q&A. Our first excellence scholar is Ozan Ayata of Carleton University. Ozan, please take it away.
Thank you, Professor Saidman, for the introduction. It's an honor and pleasure to be here today to introduce our first panel. To start things off, our first speaker, Vanessa Brown, is a faculty member of the Department of Defense Studies at the Royal Military College and is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. Her doctoral work is concerned with the process of integrating gender and cultural perspectives in professional military education and its influence on organizational culture change. Vanessa's latest publication, Situating Feminist Progress in Professional Military Education, was included in a special issue on gender in the Canadian Armed Forces for Atlantis. Thank you, Vanessa, for being here today. Our second speaker, Dr. Linna Tam-Seto, is the Canadian Defence and Security Network Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Centre for International and Defence Policy at Queen's University. She holds a PhD in rehabilitation science and is a registered occupational therapist with extensive experience in the areas of children and adolescent mental health, along with professional practice for healthcare providers. Dr. Seto's research interests include understanding the health and well-being of Canada's military members, veterans, public safety personnel, and their families, with a focus on life transitions and changes. An additional focus on the experience of servicewomen and women veterans. Thank you, Dr. Seto, for your attendance today. Our third speaker, Stephanie Houle, is currently completing her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa and is also in the process of completing her pre-doctoral internship at the Center for Psychological Services and Research. Stephanie's research interests center around the psychological impact of stressful military experiences, with a particular focus on understanding the clinical utility of the moral injury construct. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us today. Our last speaker for this panel, Dr. Peter Kikkert, is the Irving Shipbuilding Chair in the Arctic Policy and Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Governance at St. Francis Xavier University. Dr. Kikkert has written extensively on safety, security, and sovereignty issues in the polar regions. His current research program explores how to strengthen search and rescue, emergency management, and community resiliency and disaster response capabilities in Canada's north. Thank you so much for all the speakers for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to our first presenter, Vanessa Brown.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and to learn from my fellow panelists. And I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that I live and work on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and Chippewa. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So I'm going to present today a paper that I originally presented for the Women, Peace, and Security Curriculum Consortium. And really this paper was an engagement with fellow educators who are trying to incorporate gender perspectives within professional military education more broadly. So the name of the paper is Naming the Patriarchy Within Professional Military Education on Gender Perspectives. And I'll begin with my presentation now. Canada's defense policy and internal direction on the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 commits the military to supporting the goals of women, peace, and security. Work to support women, peace, and security is facilitated by the military through its application of gender-based analysis plus and gender perspectives to operations and within institutional policy plans and actions. The government and the military commits to women, peace, and security as a requirement, and this has required enhanced training and education on gender and cultural perspectives for military members. As such, feminist and critical scholars within Canadian military colleges have leveraged this requirement to expand on teaching about gender and intersectionality within professional military education. In doing so, two potential issues have been raised. Some educators in the field, more broadly, have suggested that it would be necessary to avoid presenting critical concepts like patriarchy, feminism, racism, and colonialism to military audiences. Others have indicated that presenting gender perspectives and analysis tools in an absence of considering the theoretical lenses from which they've emerged sets practitioners up for failure when implementing women, peace, and security, as well as gender perspectives in their work. Together, the concern expressed by some is that military practitioners are resistant to or cannot understand concepts necessary to advance women, peace, and security. Yet my experience teaching senior officers has demonstrated a different orientation and revealed ways to attune military professionals to struggles for belonging, equality, and justice. These ways offered by myself and an active group of military and civilian educators at Canadian Forces College have set conditions for military members to acknowledge patriarchy and colonialism, to understand their place within these struggles, and to think critically about their role in supporting gender equality and inclusive security. My experiences and those of my colleagues have broken with the idea that presenting gender to a military audience requires walking on eggshells. that somehow it's best to avoid more challenging explanations of sexism, racism, and ableism as systemic in Canada and institutionalized within the military. That when speaking to gender inequality, patriarchy, and the goals of critical feminism, it's best to leave out the historical bits such as colonialism and the military's role in upholding power and status of mostly white settler males in Canadian society. I've been cautioned by educators in the field against the cognitive dissonance that military personnel might feel when thinking about how, particularly at the mid to senior leadership level, they came to be successful in and through an institution that continues to promote mostly white males to senior leadership positions, despite the institution's great efforts to change. But perhaps these expressions of caution are much to do with context and pedagogic approach. In a male-dominated institution, the process of naming the patriarchy can be daunting. And it may be difficult to present gender in a way that is hopeful and encouraging to military members. It's a challenge to create a learning environment where military members feel empowered to think critically about their and the military's relationship to gender inequality, power, and struggle. But in my experience, working diligently to do just that has emboldened so many military members to become passionate champions for gender equality. Findings from my PhD research show that military leaders who have been exposed to critical race and feminist theories, as well as tools, yield promising and transformative results within the military and through engagements with Canadian and international societies. But it's not all roses. I've been teaching military members about gender equality, diversity, and inclusion within the Joint Command and Staff program for the past 5 years. During that time, a small but growing group of military and civilian faculty have worked diligently, often through adversity, to develop and include critical curriculum on women, peace, and security, gender, and diversity. And in my perspective, as well as the perspectives of many graduates, our collective struggle to lace these ideas as cross-cutting throughout all areas of military learning and development is working. Students of the Joint Command and Staff program are now learning about gender and culture's deep relationship to security and insecurity, global governance, command and leadership, as well as domestic and international operations. They're learning about how gender, race, and culture shape and influence vulnerability and safety. Through this learning, military students are also creating their own collaborative spaces to discuss how ideas about gender, race, ability, and sexuality come to be understood in society and within the military through often taken for granted conceptions of the way things are. Noting that these constructed ideas are subject to change, military students are taking action to be a prominent part of that change. For example, over the course of the current academic year, students have created an online learning group that contemplates how military identity has been traditionally defined around a narrow view of masculinity. In these sessions, students have explored alternative ways to define the warrior and the military identity, ways that could contribute to institutionally desired culture change. JCSP graduates have also created long-standing WhatsApp groups and book clubs and PD opportunities for their own unit lines to consider and collaborate on gender, diversity, and culture change. These groups are beginning to disseminate critical thinking about gender more horizontally across the military. So let's talk a moment about honesty. My experiences teaching and researching about the inclusion of critical feminist and race frameworks within professional military education have given me much hope for the future of the Canadian Armed Forces. They have driven home for me that so many educators and curriculum developers within the institution are vital for this change that the institution desires, but also that this education is vitally important for culture change within the military. Educators and curriculum developers can't hope to support the changes that military leaders desire if we tiptoe around and through discussions about the lived realities of inequality. And military leaders can't expect to make the best choices if they haven't been given adequate theoretical frameworks, practical tools, and the time to apply them in a way that they too can be vulnerable, make mistakes, and learn from them. The military classroom is one of the few safe spaces where military leaders can participate in this sort of iterative collaboration, self-learning, and collective innovation without having the weight of command. So PME offers a sacred and unique context for military learners to practice being agents of change. In fact, I know that honesty about the great and often devastating impact of inequality is the only way in which military members can really come to understand feminist and anti-racist visions for equality. Critical thinking about exclusion is the only way in which military members could ever really meaningfully understand and pursue inclusion. And you know what I found? Honesty works. Telling the whole story, not just the glossy good stuff, works. And getting the military learners to share their lived experiences and roles within this story can illuminate ways forward for military learners as a group. Importantly, doing so can chart a path for meaningful changes within the military organization. In my view, naming the patriarchy in whatever way educators choose to do this is a key part of the requisite baseline knowledge to understand and apply frameworks from the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, including gender perspectives and GBA+. But I think that it is critically important to demonstrate how the struggle for gender equality is a global struggle, it's a Canadian struggle, a whole of government struggle, and importantly, it's a struggle that remains within the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces. And in this way, I've found that it's important to start the conversation about gender equality with some basics. So first, gender inequality happens at all levels of our social world. As such, in my teaching practices, I like to position gender inequality and the struggle for intersectional equality more broadly as a challenge for everyone. Importantly, I like to be clear that gender inequality is a deep and long-standing manifestation of insecurity. So deep and so enduring that most people fail to recognize it, even in moments when they themselves are experiencing situations of intense discrimination, vulnerability, and violence. Second, military personnel require a clear understanding of the social construction of difference. Social constructions of difference tend to order people into categories that scale from the most ideal to the least ideal. These constructions or stories that societies create about difference are culturally specific, dependent on context, and change over time. While differences are a fact of our social reality, the unfair and unequal meanings and values associated with difference are socially constructed. These socially constructed systems of power are those systems of power that create inequality in the first place. These are the stories that we make up, that we negotiate, that we rebel against, and that we maintain over time as a culture. They are the stories that we as a community have a responsibility to change. And importantly, military members must feel encouraged and recognize their agency in leading this change. Third, military personnel require a good understanding of gender roles and how these roles shift or are amplified in times of social unrest. And importantly, military personnel need a deep understanding about gender perspectives. They need to know the differential and unequal ways in which particular groups of people come to be positioned in situations of vulnerability and insecurity. Fourth, and perhaps most important, military personnel require a good understanding about gender as a socially constructed concept. While all people live gendered lives, and while most people have some understanding about the impact of gender roles and norms, gender remains a difficult and essential concept to define. The difficulty is because socially constructed ideas and norms and values about gender evolve over time. These evolving ideas about gender influence the responsibilities people are assigned, the activities they undertake, their access to and control over resources, as well as decision-making. Differing cultural narratives about gender set the conditions for different sorts and degrees of gender inequality in societies. And for example, longstanding dynamics among gender, power, and authority in the Canadian Armed Forces can be enabling of mundane issues from a chilly climate to extreme inequalities across military members, such as harassment and abuse. As anti-racist and feminist scholar Tammy George argues, military members can greatly benefit from a critical look at the constructions of gender and race within their own institutions. This requires an understanding about members' own socialization to the military and the gender idealizations they internalize and promote within. Military members can better engage with the central tenets of women, peace, and security, the protection of civilians and vulnerable populations, by examining these same vulnerabilities, risks, and inequalities and exclusions that take place within the military context. Recognizing how aspects of WPS relate to the status of members within the military, such as the participation of women in senior leadership, protection against sexual and gender-based violence within the institution, and the pursuit for gender and intersectional equality among members, can help to ground military members' knowledge and applications of gender perspectives and GBA+ in a reality they are already intimately know. This reckoning of military gender inequalities through this positional turn within can assist professionals to better understand their role in the achievement of security commitments domestically and internationally. And I'd like to sum up this conversation with a last comment about the narratives that live within the military about gender perspectives and about WPS and about diversity. I've noted that academic and military educators have applied a range of justifications for why the military and its members should care about WPS and diversity. As examined by many scholars and practitioners over the course of the proceedings at the WPS Curriculum Consortium, we must be careful about framing gender perspectives so closely with operational effectiveness. While diversity and gender perspectives have many demonstrated operational advantages, these should not constitute the military's primary reason for desiring diverse teams and the use of GBA+. The overarching reason should be the military's commitment to the achievement of equality and security for all people. The idea isn't what gender perspectives and diversity can do for the military. The idea should be, what can the military do to best support meaningful belonging, justice, and security for all? I want to thank you for enabling me to represent this paper as part of the CDSN Capstone event. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the valuable contribution of my fellow panelists. And this concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Vanessa, for your fascinating presentation. We will now move over to our second speaker for this panel, Dr. Linna Tam-Seto.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to share the screen. And if I could get an indication that the screen is being shared. Think we're okay? All right. Thank you, Ozan, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the CDSN for this invitation. And I'd like to thank you all for making the time to attend the presentation today. So I'm going to share with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last year on women in mentorship in the Canadian Armed Forces. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around the methods of the study, and we'll focus more on the findings and next steps. What this study aimed to do was to try to figure out what a gender-informed, culturally competent mentorship program may look like for women who are actively serving Reg Force members in the CAF. A multi-method approach is being used, and that's has included a review of the literature, interviews with subject matter experts, mentors and mentees in the Canadian Armed Forces, and a review of resources developed specifically for D&D and CAF, as well as those resources that are not specific to any profession. And using all this data, a framework analysis process will be used to create a mentorship program. And there are plans to conduct a validation study once the mentorship program has been developed. So with the scoping review, it was the method that was decided on to complete a review of the literature with the question of how does the literature conceptualize and describe mentorship and mentorship programs in the military adjacent, and police services for women. So even though the actual mentorship program development does not include the police, there is enough similarity in the nature of the work, the gender makeup of these types of professions and their cultures that warranted their inclusion in the Lit Review. So here are some of the general findings from the scoping review. There were 23 studies included. All but 3 were about US populations. There were a number of different research methods included in the review. There was a fairly wide representation of military elements, military healthcare, and police representation in the review literature. And of the papers that had some kind of focus on gender, there were about 6 that were gender specific, and 10 papers that did a comparison between genders. As you can see here, there was a range of populations that was the focus of the studies, including health services, military leadership, military education, law enforcement. There were also different identities that were considered in the culture, such as race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation. So there were 4 key findings from the scoping review, which I would like to share with you. The first one was around the definition of mentorship. So as it turns out, the literature I looked at doesn't do a good job at defining what mentorship is, because there is this general assumption out there that everyone knows what mentorship is. And as a result, there appears that many organizations are left on their own to figure out how it's defined. And this will come up later on as an issue later on in this presentation. The second theme from the Lit Review is that mentorship appears to be used by many different professions for different purposes. Those main purposes were one of 2. The first one being during transition. So mentorship was used during significant transition periods. So when people were joining the military as cadets, in military or police, or when people were just leaving the military or police service. The other reason why mentorship was used in these organizations was to sort of support them throughout their career. So it started very early on and it continued on into high leadership ranks. The impact of culture and mentorship. So the role of identity in mentorship. So identity appears to be a factor that is actively examined in mentorship literature, including, like I had mentioned before, gender, sexual orientation, age, race, and gender. The literature has found that one's identity does impact on the nature of mentorship in these professions. So for example, the dominance of masculinity has been positively associated with career-based mentoring. And there's been quite a bit of work done examining the benefits of mixed gender mentorship pairing versus same gender mentorship pairing. Based on existing evidence that supports the use of mentorship in minority populations like women and ethnic minorities, military and police services have created opportunities for members in these groups to participate in mentoring by integrating mentoring programs and initiatives into the existing culture of the service. And because of the differences in these cultures, it has been proven to be quite challenging. So one example is a review done by Johnson and Anderson that identified several challenges with implementing membership as it's defined in its truest sense and within the structure of the military. So Johnson and Anderson found that there are such varied definitions of mentorship used across the military, and as a result contributes to the confusion of what mentorship actually is, because there is this sort of historical context of mentorship as being equated to exclusivity, unfairness, cronyism, and favoritism. So now I'd like to share with you some of the results from the interviews that have been conducted with subject matter experts, mentors, and mentees of the CAF. So the subject matter experts weren't necessarily had some sort of connection with the CAF. So I just want to share that bit with you. So here are some of the questions presented to the participants in the semi-structured interviews. So I was really interested in their experience with mentorship, trying to elicit some storytelling about, positive and negative experiences with mentorship, and what they think about mentorship specifically for women. So a total of 28 interviews were completed by phone. So unfortunately, given the pandemic, we weren't able to do any face-to-face or any focus groups data collection, of which 21 were women. Reg Force, Army, Navy, and Air Force were represented in the data right across Canada, and also included those on international deployments. There was a range of ranks that was represented in the data set. And Canadian international veterans were also represented in the subject matter expert group, as well as people who identified as consultants within the private sector. So the first finding from the interviews is that the lived experiences of mentorship for women in the CAF is actually really reflective of the international literature. So that was quite interesting for me to find. Similar to the literature, the definition of mentorship in the military is quite varied. Another finding is that that mentorship is being used throughout the course of one's career. And identity, predominantly gender, which was sort of the focus of this study, appears to play a factor in mentoring. And gender culture and military culture most definitely play a significant role. The interviews also revealed a lot about the current experiences of mentorship for women in the CAF. And this included the fact that successful and happy mentees became successful and happy mentors themselves. Mentors in the CAF all learned sort of on the job as a mentor, or by receiving excellent mentorship themselves. So no formal education really was provided. There was acknowledgement that there are resources and supports available, but this is not widely known. Some participants were part of formal mentorship matchups, such as through WISE Canada or Elevate Aviation. And many described mentorship pairing as akin to dating, so emphasizing the importance of compatibility regardless of gender, rank, or profession. There was a great deal of discussion on cultures and the tensions that exist between dominant cultures on women's experiences in the CAF, and that being the reason for seeking or providing gender-specific mentorship. So with regards to Canadian culture, there was a lot of discussion on gendered roles in family, caretaking, that sort of thing. And with regards to military culture, there was discussion around sort of the rigidity of the promotion trajectory, either officially or unofficially, and those timelines that may conflict with said caretaking roles. There was also this assumption out there that leadership knowledge is the same as mentorship knowledge. And most people indicated that it's not one and the same. There's this general sense of support in the CAF for mentorship by means of leadership encouraging people to get involved, examples of formal programs. And for those who ascribe to traditional roles and perspectives of the military, this idea of all soldiers are the same mentality came out. And as a result, there's no need for a woman-focused mentorship program. So not everyone I spoke to was in favor of the proposed idea of a gender-specific mentorship program. Gender identity and the role it has in mentorship was also described in the interview data. Women's lived experiences in the CAF are different from men. And as a result, women are looking for support. For example, equipment and uniforms that don't quite fit right, exposure to sexualized environment and sexual misconduct, and COVID-19 pandemic. It isn't left women in the CAF untouched. Women right across Canada and internationally have taken the bulk of caretaking in families, and women that I spoke to during data collection, and we happen to be doing it in the middle of the pandemic, did attest to this sort of imbalance. Women were finding that they were working from home more than their male counterparts, even if they held the same rank, role, and responsibility. A common topic of conversation between women mentors and mentees is around how women need to or should manage within the existing military culture. So discussions of, don't fight the system. You need to work within the system, what you can do within the system was something that came up. And finally, the topic of work-life balance, family planning, that sort of thing appears to be the most common issue discussed in mentoring conversations. And finally, with all my interviews, I ask the magic wand question. So what would participants like to see in an ideal mentorship program? And I just want to share some of those comments. There was discussion that mentorship programs should be somewhat formal and prioritized, where it runs outside yet parallel to the chain of command. That formal education should be provided through the course of one's military career on what mentorship is, the benefits of mentorship, and how to do mentorship. I thought the idea of matchmaking approach to matching mentors and mentees was an interesting one. That more than rank and professions should be considered. Personality and expectations of a mentoring relationship should be factored in when matching. So very much similar to dating. And there needs to be a balance. We need to find that balance between a formal mandated program and one that's informal. The concern with a formal program is that people will see it as another thing that's added to their workload, where the concern with an informal one is that there won't be any external accountability to a mentoring relationship, contributing to this lack of mentorship culture in the CAF. So with next steps, is doing an analysis of the existing resources within the CAF, doing the framework analysis technique to create a mentorship framework that'll be the foundation of the program, and conducting a validation study, and continue to engage in conversations to promote this idea of a mentorship program specifically for women in the Canadian Armed Forces. Just want to wrap things up. I want to say thank you to the transcription team from the Gender Lab for helping me with it, with all the transcribing all the interviews. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of CPO Sean Wilcox from the Canadian Forces Training Development Center for his assistance with recruitment in the study. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the men and women in the CAF who I had the privilege of speaking to, and acknowledge the support of the CIDP at Queen's and the CDSN for this postdoc opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tam-Seto. We will now move over to our third presenter, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to get my screen set up here. Someone could just acknowledge that you can see it. This is the most awkward part of doing this online. Okay, great. Thank you. So first, thank you so much for including me in this wonderful seminar today. I really appreciate being on such a great panel. Before I begin, I do also want to acknowledge with gratitude that I live and work on the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'd also like to thank Stephanie Boulanger at the Canadian Institute of Military and Veteran Health Research for nominating me to be a part of this great project. And also I'm grateful for the support of Wounded Warriors Canada and the Institute of Mental Health Research for the funding they provided me and my team, our team, on this study. I'd also like to thank my awesome co-authors for this project, Colin Vincent, a superstar social worker who does great work with this population. Colonel Rakesh Jetley is a psychiatrist with Canadian Forces and chair of military mental health at the Royal in Ottawa, and my thesis advisor, Dr. Andrea Ashbaugh, who's been an incredible support to me throughout this journey. So essentially today, what I'm going to be reviewing, and first I'd like to say in my excitement to talk to you all today about moral injury, I prepared too many slides, so you'll see me skip a few, but I'm happy to make those available for people who want to review all of them. So please don't hesitate to contact me if you want more information. So today I'm going to be introducing you to the concept of moral injury. I'm going to be providing results of a study that I conducted here in Ottawa to kind of give a voice to the experiences that people have had of feeling distressed by morally injurious experiences. And then I'll talk a little bit about the clinical relevance of that for the Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans. So essentially, the term moral injury has come to describe the psychospiritual consequences of events that deeply transgress a person's core moral beliefs and values. And the name that's become prevalent for this type of experience is potentially morally injurious experiences. In the recognition that not everyone who will experience an event like this will go on to have a moral injury or some kind of psychological or spiritual consequences of the event. In general, these types of events, a definition of these types of events is the perpetration, failure to prevent, or witnessing of acts that really deeply transgress a person's moral beliefs and expectations. Some examples of these types of events are combat experiences, for example, or peacekeeping experiences in which there were morally ambiguous situations. What action to take was not certain for the individual, might have led to unintended harm for either comrades or civilians, for example. Witnessing atrocities and being kind of hit with the moral weight of seeing massacres and atrocities, for example, and also feeling betrayed by others, commanders, leaders, institution. I think we're seeing a lot of that starting to come out now with instances being reported of military sexual assault and people feeling as though the military itself is not taking care of people. And I'm happy to see that there's a lot of change going on there, but that's also an example of types of experiences that could lead to these consequences. The prevalence of these types of events is rather high. The studies that I'm showing you now, these statistics come from deployed service members. So this first statistic of 49 to 84% of individuals who report atrocities, exposure to atrocities or massacres, that's pre-Afghanistan era. So peacekeeping conflicts like Rwanda and Balkans, where people report quite a high exposure to these types of experiences. And the second statistic, up to 56% of people who report exposure to any of those types of events, those three events listed below, is from the post-Afghanistan or Afghanistan cohort of deployed individuals from the Canadian Forces Health Survey. I don't have time to go too much into the types of what constitutes the factors that might lead to events like this, but there's a slide here that I can send, and essentially certain factors like feeling as though the rules of engagement are too restrictive, inaccurate intelligence being acted upon, the culture within the unit on deployment. This is information from the United States, I should say, where, in the culture, there's a dehumanization of the enemy. All of these factors together can lead to the experience of morally injurious events. So how does one then get from exposure to a potentially morally injurious event to moral injury? Well, in the middle here, we can see that there's a certain degree of moral pain that we would expect, that is a human part of experience of being exposed to these types of experiences. Difficult moral emotions like guilt and shame, cognitions of self-condemnation. Could I have acted differently? This is my fault. But where things turn to what we call a moral injury is really when there is an inability for the individual to reconcile that moral pain, and where because they can't reconcile that moral pain, the impact on their well-being in terms of their psychological, spiritual well-being becomes expanded and leads to distress and some degree of impairment or difficulties in their functioning. So I'd like to present now the results of a study I did. I interviewed 18 service members and veterans in Ottawa who were seeking treatment for operational stress injuries, all of whom reported an exposure to a potentially morally injurious event. And I asked questions about the impact of this event on their identity, their spirituality, their interpersonal functioning, and their emotional state, etc. So the first theme that we were able to identify was a change in moral attitude. So people tended to see that these experiences were a catalyst for them thinking differently about morality or about, the way that the world works. And there were three patterns that we observed here. So rigidity, people feeling or expressing more of a black and white view of morality. Things are either right or they're wrong. A confusion, so not being able to understand what is right and wrong, and that being really distressing for the individual. And then also pessimism, just a general gloomy outlook on life or on kind of disillusion. You can see the quote here represents that rigidity that I was talking about.
Vous pouvez voir la citation ici qui représente cette rigidité que je mentionnais. Cette personne dit « J'ai toujours su la différence entre le bien et le mal, mais je pense que la ligne est beaucoup plus mince entre les deux. » Et on parle de la confusion morale.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, Stephanie. Alex, you're on the wrong channel. We're getting French on the English, so I just needed to get that fixed. Sorry about that. You can continue.
Okay. So this quote is meant to exemplify that moral confusion that I said. It's crazy, but the way the world works and my sense of trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong, who's right and who's wrong, drove me completely insane. The next major theme that we observed was an increased sensitivity or reactivity to moral situations. And this manifested in a few different ways. Either a heightened sense of personal responsibility, of someone feeling as though because of this transgressive event, I really need to pay attention to my actions and make sure that I'm acting as a morally good person. And also a vigilance or kind of a bias towards viewing situations as through a moral lens, whereas they might not have before. And also kind of increased reactions to moral situations. So reacting more strongly to moral slights than they might have in the past before the event. This individual says, do what is right. That's really the only standard. Now it goes to the more subtle things, like it's your job to show up on time. It's rude to be late for an appointment. I'm majoring in the minor, if you will. So that's an example of kind of this heightened sense of morality, even to mundane things like being late for an appointment. This person now sees that through a moral lens and feels upset by being morally slighted for something like this. This exemplifies this increased sense of personal responsibility. This individual said, it has a lot to do with my belief that I failed. I've been overcompensating by being overly protective, but now it's ridiculous, it's overboard, and it's all because of the event and the consequences from it. A couple of other themes that we saw are loss of trust in oneself. So as oneself as a moral agent or in one's ability to take moral actions, but more pervasively, we saw a loss of trust in others, including institutions themselves, important sources of spirituality, for example, a loss of trust in God or in humanity. And another theme that we saw was a rumination. So people trying to kind of, you can see that their efforts to reconcile the event as being a part of their distress. being preoccupied with it, going over it again and again. As this person says, like why it happened, how I could have avoided it, was there a solution that could have happened? If I could go back in time, how I would have done it differently. If I could have done it differently, new things come to my mind all the time that trigger me back. So again, kind of putting yourself in the shoes of these individuals who are really struggling to reconcile their morally injurious experience, and that being part of the presentation of distress that they're living. I'm going to skip this one. Some other areas of disruption that we observed were in identity, spirituality, and interpersonal relatedness. So we saw individuals struggle to reconcile their identity in the sense that the person that I was now is not the person that I would want to be or that I was before I experienced this event, and that being troublesome for them. We also saw a large proportion of participants talk about a devalued sense of self, of feeling not worthy, tainted, or as a bad person. Disruptions in spirituality, again, we saw this pattern of dissonance, of not being able to reconcile one's previous spiritual values, what was important to the person, what actions the person felt was purposeful with this event. And also in some individuals, just a loss of spirituality, because of what I've seen and done, I no longer believe in a higher being or in the goodness of people, for example. And then disruptions also in interpersonal relatedness, of people feeling that the event has led to a loss of connection with important communities, important individuals, and as well a sense of guardedness, of feeling like they had to protect themselves for fear of being found out for the experience. And there are a few quotes here that I'd like to share to exemplify these themes. I'm going to skip that one. This person says, "I thought of myself as a bad person. I was always thinking of how, if I ever told what happened to your average Canadian, they would look at me and see and think, this guy's a monster." So again, putting yourself in the shoes of the individual who has experienced an event like this, and the distress that comes from the belief that they are truly a bad person and needing to conceal that from others. This person says, "I'm fearful of being found out, of being seen like a bad person, or as someone who doesn't fit into society very well." Again, that guardedness and sense of devalued self. This individual says, "If I tell my wife I love her, it's because I think she wants to hear it. I don't know. It's like I'm looking at people from a different perspective, not from my own. It's almost like not an out-of-body experience, but a third party's involved. That's kind of related to the people around me. It's just an emptiness." So here is meant to exemplify that loss of connection that I was discussing. And this person feeling kind of completely removed from and empty in relation to people that are important, in this case, this person's wife. And the last theme that we observed was patterns of internalizing and externalizing emotions and behaviors. Internalizing emotions are those that lead to kind of a sense of withdrawal, of wanting to kind of hide away emotions like guilt, shame, anxiety, and sadness. And externalizing emotions are those that lead to kind of some action in the outside world, or externalization of the emotion. In this case, anger and irritability, things like kind of snapping, lashing out, yelling, those types of emotions that lead to those types of behaviors. And there were kind of two ways that this manifested itself again, was a prolonged reaction to the potentially morally injurious event. So feeling shame as a result of the event, but also in relation to other symptoms. So for example, that rumination leading to these difficult emotions, or reflecting on the moral nature of the world and loss of spirituality as making one feel sad, for example. So I'm going to skip this, but it's suffice to say that a lot of what we found really does overlap with what's been found in other studies, especially in the United States. So there is a lot of similarities between the presentation that we're observing in the Canadian Forces, at least for this study in Ottawa, and what's been found elsewhere as well. I'm going to skip that one. In terms of the clinical relevance of moral injury, one of the most robust findings that we see is that exposure to potentially morally injurious events are consistently related with suicidality. And there's studies to show that severity of moral injury is associated with a history of suicidality, regardless of PTSD severity. So there's some indication that there is, that it's not just PTSD that might be driving this experience, but there might be something particular. And one of the hypotheses for this is that the established risk factors for suicide, such as feelings of guilt, shame, loss of spirituality or purpose, burdensomeness, that those appear to overlap with the features of moral injury. So that's one reason why we really need to be paying attention to moral injury. One of the main questions in this field is, moral injury and PTSD, are they the same? Are they different? And there are short answers. There's a couple ways that they're similar, and they're noted on this slide, but there's some important ways in which they're different. So they're similar in that this extremely stressful event leads to psychological distress and impairment in functioning, but the quality of those events is different. For a moral injury, it would be a transgressive as being the catalyst for the outcome, whereas in classic PTSD, the way we understand it is there's an event that threatens the physical integrity of the person, and that's what leads to the outcomes. The core emotional reactions in moral injury are guilt and shame, whereas in PTSD, we understand it as being fear-based. And more importantly, kind of the function of the symptoms and how they're maintained. So avoidance is an important part of PTSD, but it is an important part of moral injury as well. But like we saw, whereas someone with PTSD might be avoiding threatening situations or situations in which they feel are in danger, a person with moral injury might avoid other people for fear of being found out. So in terms of the implications, for the clinical realm, but also outside of that, there's implications for policy in terms of access to benefits. If the pattern of distress associated with potentially morally injurious events doesn't fit into PTSD or depression or another diagnostic entity, does that mean that people who experience this pattern of distress, but it isn't recognized, are not getting the benefits that they might need and the support that they might need? In terms of military training, there's some work beginning now to try and integrate more ambiguous ethical scenarios into military training in an effort to try and prevent individuals from having these more extreme morally injurious reactions. And as well, there's implications for military culture and cohesion. I think especially in the case of military sexual assault and gender issues within the military, like my colleagues were talking about. If people feel like the environment in which they are working is more cohesive and that they feel comfortable, that they won't be betrayed if they do need to talk about events that are really disturbing to them, then that is going to be a good thing for everybody. So I will end there and happy to talk more about this during the question period. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Stephanie. We will now move over to our last speaker for this panel, Dr. Kikkert.
Hey, thanks very much. Just setting up the PowerPoint here really quickly. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm speaking from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I want to start by thanking the Canadian Defence and Security Network for giving me the opportunity to speak today, to my fellow presenters for sharing their fantastic research, and to all of you for taking the time to tune in. I'd also like to thank Dr. Whitney Lockenbauer, who initially invited me to participate in this project, exploring the metrics of success for the Canadian Rangers. My work on the Ranger role in building community disaster resilience flows from this broader study. Finally, I'd like to thank the dozens of Rangers who sat down for focus groups and interviews and agreed to share their emergency and disaster management experiences and who continue to stand ready to protect their communities each and every day. So let's go back to April 2020. With COVID-19 cases mounting, the Canadian Armed Forces activated hundreds of Rangers across the country as part of Operation Laser. Serving in their own or neighboring communities, Rangers performed an incredible array of tasks, from community wellness checks, to preparing triage points, to cutting firewood and clearing snow, to delivering prescription medication and providing traditional foods. As Master Corporal Rowena Osborne from Harrington Harbour in the Lower North Shore explained to me, our main focus was on comforting our community. During this time of domestic and international crisis, the Canadian Rangers provided the Government of Canada with an additional layer of local capacity that it could quickly leverage to enhance its COVID-19 response efforts. As Rangers responded to the pandemic in April and May 2020, The communities of Fort Vermilion in Northern Alberta, Hay River in the Northwest Territories, and Keshewan in Northern Ontario all requested the assistance of their local ranger patrols in the face of flooding. Fort Vermilion in particular faced once-in-generation flooding, and its 25 rangers were engaged in preparation and response activities, helping over 450 residents with the evacuation of their homes and earning high praise from their neighbors as a result. Their involvement in flood relief activities and in the response to COVID-19 highlight a role that Canadian Rangers have been playing for decades. By virtue of their capabilities and presence, they regularly support other government agents in preventing, preparing for, responding to, and recovering from the broad spectrum of emergency and disaster situations facing their communities. In short, they are a source of disaster resilience, helping them to anticipate, prevent, or mitigate the damage disasters might cause, to cope and respond effectively during a crisis, and to recover and adapt in its aftermath. So based off government reports, media analysis, after action reports, and focus groups with dozens of rangers, the main objective for this presentation is to highlight that the Canadian Rangers offer a response to a really difficult question. How can targeted government investment effectively build disaster resilience in at-risk, remote, and isolated communities with small populations, limited infrastructure, few local resources, and little access to rapid external assistance? Over the next few minutes, I'll dive into the variables that allow the Rangers to strengthen the disaster resiliency of their communities, and then offer a few thoughts on how, through modest additional funding and an increase in the number of paid annual service days, these Ranger attributes can be leveraged and amplified moving forward. So just a little context. Canadian Rangers are self-sufficient, part-time, non-commissioned members of a subcomponent of the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves that serve as the eyes, ears, and voice of the CAF in sparsely settled northern, coastal, and isolated areas, conducting surveillance and presence patrols, collecting local data, assisting with domestic military operations, and, as we're discussing today, participating in public safety missions. Approximately 5,000 Rangers in 5 patrol groups live in more than 200 communities. Over 60% are Indigenous, they speak at least 26 different languages, and 21% are female. Ranger patrols are organized by community with an average of 25 to 30 members and a minimum of 8. Patrols are led by a patrol commander, a sergeant, a second in command, a master or corporal, who are elected into these positions by patrol members. Rangers are expected to be self-sufficient when on the land and are reimbursed for use of their own personal gear, but are also provided with modest equipment, including the famous red hoodie, navigation aids, camp stores, comms gear, and a bolt-action rifle. Now, for a quick introduction to community disaster resilience. A community's level of resilience depends on a complex array of factors. Strong socioeconomic, physical, and psychological health, effective government and key services, adequate physical and human infrastructure. A community's disaster resilience is best built from the bottom up in a whole of community approach that mobilizes relationships and networks, fosters effective leadership, taps into existing personal and collective skills, knowledge, and resources, and develops key capacities, such as hazard analysis and emergency response capabilities as required. The presence of community-based organizations, such as voluntary community emergency response teams, directly engaged in disaster management can help to develop many of the assets required by disaster-resilient communities. Many of the key building blocks of community disaster resilience are brought together in Canadian Ranger patrols. The first is the simple fact that they are ready, willing, and present. Canadian Rangers view the protection of their communities as one of their primary responsibilities. A ranger from Chuliak, Nunavut, explained to me that we are the eyes and ears of the military, but we are also the eyes and ears of our community. We protect our communities. This sense of social responsibility ensures that Rangers are willing to respond to emergencies and disasters. While many people join the Rangers out of a desire to safeguard their communities, the modest pay, annual training, and additional tasks they are given also serve to keep them prepared and engaged. This is an important element that differentiates the Rangers from all volunteer CERT groups that often struggle to maintain motivation, retain personnel, and secure the funding they require for training, equipment, and relationship building. Pay is particularly important when Rangers need to be mobilized for sustained periods during prolonged emergencies such as Operation Laser. The organization of the Rangers into patrols at the community level ensures that they can respond as a group almost immediately, an important consideration in remote communities situated in austere environments, where emergencies can quickly cascade into something more profound. Now, due to their presence and state of readiness, Ranger patrols provide an effective and timely local and regional response, whether it be to a sudden avalanche, flooding, a plane crash, or a prolonged power failure. Another key building block is the annual training that CAF provides Canadian Rangers, which is tailored to local conditions, but usually involves elements directly related to emergency and disaster management. First aid, ground search and rescue, constructing emergency airstrips, effective communications. Depending on the hazards faced by a Ranger Patrol's community or their involvement in large-scale disaster exercises, their training might also include advanced SAR, flood, fire, earthquake response, community evacuations, and a multitude of other scenarios. These activities also allow them to build the relationships and experience working with outside organizations that they can leverage during emergencies in and around their communities. Canadian Ranger Patrols and the junior Canadian Rangers they mentor also serve as platforms for the transmission of traditional and local knowledge and skills, generally from elders to younger members. For Indigenous people serving as Rangers, this traditional knowledge often includes information on how to identify natural hazards, reduce risks, and how to determine appropriate responses, all key elements of disaster resilience. Now, this intergenerational transmission of knowledge and the formal training that occurs in Ranger Patrols effectively address several gaps identified with disaster risk reduction in Canadian Indigenous communities, including limited space made for traditional knowledge and practice, lack of opportunity to develop their local emergency response capabilities, and challenges working with outside agencies like the CAF. Ranger Patrols represent a community-based, culturally appropriate, and proven solution to many of these challenges. Rangers also play important parts in resilience building, planning, preparedness, and hazard risk analysis measures, with many patrols having defined responsibilities in regional and community emergency plans. As the eyes and ears of the military and their communities, Rangers watch for potential natural hazards like ice and water levels in nearby river systems or dangerous wildfire conditions. Ranger patrols often use their monthly meetings to conduct informal hazard risk analysis by discussing what they have seen on the land and what might pose a risk to their communities moving forward. Now, given how well the Rangers know their communities, they are also well placed to execute whole of community resource mapping to identify capacity, strengths, and deficits, which they often do through the completion of local area resource reports, which have provided key intel in past disaster situations, including the 2017 BC wildfires. Strong leadership, which delegates responsibilities and tasks in an expedient manner, is a vital building block of disaster resilience. Ranger patrols provide important opportunities and the space to develop a deep pool of leaders at the local level, which can be leveraged during emergencies. The CAF also provides Ranger sergeants and master corporals with annual leadership training to help them organize, plan, coordinate, and solve problems more effectively. And sometimes these training activities actually involve responding to emergency or disaster scenarios. But few qualities enhance the impact of the Rangers on the disaster resilience of their communities as much as their relationships. Canadian Ranger Patrols consist of individuals who are parts of groups and networks that span the social breadth of their communities. At the same time, Ranger Patrols foster new relationships and associations between members, ultimately forming a nexus that a community can draw upon during an emergency or disaster. The intersection of multiple social networks in a patrol ensures that its members know most or all community members, understand who is vulnerable, who needs assistance, and most importantly, they are trusted by their fellow community members. When outside agencies respond to local emergencies and disasters, Ranger patrols provide a ready entry point into the community and offer immediate access to extensive networks, all of which facilitates response activities. The Canadian Rangers' contribution to community disaster resilience are reflected clearly in community evacuations, which are always challenging, always complex, particularly in isolated communities. Indigenous communities in particular have regularly emphasized a lack of support and communication during evacuations. When Rangers have been present in communities undergoing evacuations, their training, experience, networks, leadership, and trust relationships have allowed them to mitigate some of these issues. Rangers have served as conduits between their communities and external agencies, provided translation services, performed wellness checks, registered and moved evacuees, provided support while in host communities, organized social activities, and remained behind to conduct continuous safety and security patrols. Between May and July 2019, Rangers assisted in the evacuation of the Kikkert First Nation, where a Ranger patrol with 34 members had been established that February. Chief Amanda Sanawat later described that the situation was chaotic, but the Rangers helped just by being there in their red sweaters. It gave me peace of mind that they were trained. I don't know what we would have done without them. Now, as climate change exacerbates the natural hazards that threaten many of Canada's remote and isolated communities, there are several practical ways in which the Ranger role in emergency and disaster management can be enhanced through modest additional funding and an increase in the number of paid annual service days. Right now, the CAF is too focused on simply expanding the number of the Rangers, and it's been focused on that for many years. Instead, the focus should be on expanding the Rangers' skill set, particularly with more disaster management training opportunities, including potentially courses on hazard risk analysis, prevention and mitigation, such as consistent fire smart training, consistent flood and fire watch training, consistent earthquake and tsunami response for those patrols in danger zones, training that mimics what is given to CERT or neighborhood emergency assistance teams, like extinguishing small fires or assessing damage or conducting interior SAR. Annual exercises could be conducted that include a disaster response component like community evacuations, flood relief activities, community safety checks, and training could also include mass rescue operation and major air disaster response on a regular ongoing basis. Ranger patrols can also be more engaged in planning and preparedness activities at the community and regional levels, including formalized hazard risk analysis during monthly meetings, conducting community-level hazard risk assessment in cooperation with other stakeholders, paid participation in prevention and preparedness, measures such as flood watch committees, undertaking low-scale mitigation efforts like clearing away underbrush to reduce the risks of wildfire, marking tsunami evacuation routes, etc., working with local governments to ensure that community emergency plans reflect their capabilities and provide patrols with clear roles and responsibilities, and finally being tasked to complete local area resource reports on a regular, ongoing basis. Ranger training and preparedness activities could be modeled on the U.S. Military Emergency Management Specialist Program developed by the State Guard Association for the U.S. Armed Forces. The program has 3 levels, each of which offer increasingly complex training in emergency management operations. Rangers who complete the Ranger Military Emergency Management Specialist Program could be entitled to wear a special badge and could enjoy a pay raise, for instance. And just to wrap up, through a relatively modest investment, the Government of Canada has supported the Rangers as a practical and celebrated tool to strengthen the resilience of over 200 communities in regions particularly vulnerable and exposed to natural hazards. While they are not a cure-all, the Rangers are a clear example of how community resilience can be built from the bottom up, with the CAF empowering Rangers to use their existing skills and social relations within an organizational structure that provides them with the framework, the training, and equipment they require to assist in every phase of disaster management. The Ranger role in disaster and emergency management is likely to increase in importance as the natural hazards facing these communities intensify, and the CAF should explore ways to enhance these capabilities. As Roger Hickeluk, Sergeant of the Kugluktuk Ranger Patrol says, more emergencies are coming. We need to find out what we can do. We need to talk about it. Thanks so much for letting me talk to you about it today. Thanks so much for your time. For more information, please do check out the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network and the Kikkert SAR project through these websites here. Really quickly, big thank you to the funders of the project, Neopar, Mines, Shirk, and Irving Shipbuilding. And finally, one final big thanks again to the Rangers for all that you do. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all of the panelists. That was a really interesting set of presentations. The core theme ultimately was personnel. These are all different attributes of the CAF's personnel issues, and I think they actually all spoke to each other in really, really useful and interesting ways. I've collected some questions, and I've come up with some of my own. So I'll start with Dr. Brown. I'm curious as to what resistance you faced, because it's taken me quite some time to get comfortable with talking about toxic masculinity. And I'm curious as to the debates these days where when people look back at Operation Honor, there's been discussions of how it seems like some people perceive it as a criticism or accusation leveled at men. And I'm curious as to how the men in your classes respond to some of these dynamics.
And I'll just correct with almost Dr. Brown, yeah, I think in presenting these challenging concepts to military members, it's really important to have a pedagogical practice that goes along with the content. So part of the success of engaging military members with gender perspectives is giving them the space and the environment in which they can have collaborative discussion. So it's not so much about teaching this stuff from like an Oxford style approach where they're presenting a specific set of ideas for a military audience to absorb. Instead, it's creating a feminist pedagogy, essentially, that enables the military members to think about their own positionality within the military and their experiences with understanding military identity through a gendered lens. And in doing that, then they can create a dialogue that's meaningful and anchored in their own experience. And then they can kind of navigate around the accusatory tone that often results as from teaching something like Operation Honor more in a more directive fashion than a collaborative one. So that one is using the right pedagogical approaches, I think, is as important as what's being taught in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I really appreciate that. Dr. Tam-Seto, I guess one of the things that come to mind is that mentorship in an organization that has severe gender problems might be problematic. And I was wondering if your study covered that at all about, what are the, how do we foster mentorship but don't create vulnerability?
That's a really good question. Oh.
Yep, you're on.
I think it has a lot to do with culture change. And I might also preface that the study that I looked, the people who participated in the study are also the people who are supportive of it. They tend to be. So I'm only speaking to a small segment of the population. So it wasn't sort of this broad, cross-sectional across the Canadian Armed Forces to get an appetite as to whether or not this would be something that would be effective. So I'm speaking to people who already have a stake in it. So I think that more work needs to be done to better understand if the viability of something like this.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Houle, I think your focus was more on, at the end, was more on how to prevent moral injury. I'm kind of curious as to how we should help people with moral injury, particularly not just the experts in the field, but we as who might have friends or peers, colleagues who have moral injury. How are we supposed to help these people?
Again, correction, almost Dr. Houle, but thank you. It's always nice to hear what's coming. So yeah, I think that what I did present in the end does speak more to prevention than it does to reaction. In terms of what we can do, I think as a community, I think it's just acknowledging and learning about these types of experiences so that we're more comfortable knowing what our veterans and service members face and how they might be experiencing shame, guilt, anger, their views of the world, not trying to change them, but trying to understand them from their own perspectives and acknowledging that, we can't relate to a lot of these types of experiences because we just haven't had them. I think to see that there's work going on already in training of battlefield ethics scenarios is already a really good step in the right direction of trying to, I don't think you can ever prepare somebody for what's going to affect them on a really deep moral level, but to make some effort in having that conversation before individuals go to combat, for example. In saying that these are situations that you might encounter and that might be difficult and you might want to talk about them. And then just lastly, kind of on the culture aspect of things and the institutional side, again, just acknowledging as a culture that these are things that exist and that it's okay to come forward and to talk about them and to create some structural changes so that people who do come forward and talk about these experiences are protected and respected and supported.
That's great. We also had a question from the audience for you, Dr. Houle, or semi-Dr. Houle, which is, do you find patterns across the CAF, but depending on sort of exposure, is this something that affects more people who are sort of at the very tippy point end of the spear versus the folks who are doing logistics? Is this something that's more likely to happen at Canadian Special Operators, or is this something that happens to other people? Because I seem to remember from the PTSD studies that PTSD was more widely shared. Is moral injury more narrowly focused to the folks who are actually on the ground interacting with, the war more directly?
Yeah, I think that the easiest or the best answer to that question is that I don't know. Like, there's a lot of work, I think, still to be done. This is still an emerging area of research, and we still do have a lot to learn. Most of the research today is conducted in the United States, and obviously the CAF is structured a bit differently. The values and the training is a bit different from that. So I do think it's worthwhile to put resources in trying to understand that question: is what's morally injurious for people of specific trades, for example, but also, what was I going to say? Sorry, I blanked, but I think that's enough, maybe.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Dr. Kikkert, I as a political scientist, I can't help but notice that your presentation was really positive. And I'm just trying to figure out if there's challenges that the Rangers face in terms of their support from the government. Is there political problems, given that the Indigenous people have had, I guess, the best, worse than a mixed experience with the Canadian military in the past? I guess the question I guess I really want to ask is, how do the people in the North view the Rangers? Do they look at them completely as allies, or do they look at them a little bit as agents of the government in ways that might not be seen as positive?
Hey, no, thanks for the question. Certainly, the research of Dr. Whitney Lockenbauer or Negalie Villiarm have kind of covered some of those questions in great detail, and I think their findings are similar to what I found in, again, going out on patrols with Rangers and speaking with many of them. Very, very positive. Again, from the community perspective as well, very positive. Rangers are seen with pride by their communities. They're seen as resilience builders, not just in emergency and disaster management, but also in kind of the revitalization of kind of Indigenous traditional knowledge and skills, and in just in general community well-being. The Rangers have a really prominent role playing on all those aspects. And again, yes, the CAF has had a mixed history, to say the least, with many of Canada's Indigenous communities. But the Rangers, I think, are a success story. Again, they're a different model. They're set up in a way that I think does advance community protection and community safety, and communities recognize that for sure. So during this broader project, interesting enough, exploring the ways to measure the success of the Canadian Rangers in a bit more broad way. Some of the comments from the community members that we're receiving were things like, nothing brings us greater pride than the red hoodie. When I was young, I saw them in the red hoodies and I wanted to become a Ranger as well. So there's great respect and support for the Canadian Rangers across communities, not just in the North, right, but also in coastal areas of British Columbia, coastal areas of Newfoundland and Labrador as well, across the country. And again, the response to COVID has definitely highlighted, I think, their role in community response, and certainly bolstered, I think, their how they're viewed by their communities to an even greater degree. Not to say there isn't always challenges, especially when responding to some of these disasters and emergencies. And because the Rangers are pretty good at it, doesn't mean that there's not other government investments that are also required, right, to aid in prevention and response. So certainly there's things we can talk about along those lines if we have time as well.
I guess to follow up, one of the things that I've been studying is the COVID response by the CAF in the lower part of the country, not in the north. But and one of the striking things was that when the CAF went into the long-term care facilities, they were seen as both boon and bane, I think, by the provinces, because they both helped fill in the desperate places that had lost a lot of their staff. But then they issued a report that showed that those places were problematic to begin with, that they were neglectful and abusive of the people behind them or working in them. And so I guess I'm curious as to whether the Canadian Rangers have that same sort of voice of reason that might sometimes be inconvenient to the local and national authorities, because they get to see everything. And if they're seeing everything and they're speaking up about it, that might be interesting.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm actually working right now also on a project looking at the Ranger response to COVID-19. And that, obviously there were challenges, absolutely, especially in the early stages, April, right, 2020 to May, when a lot of Rangers maybe didn't feel like they got the kind of support that is required in terms of especially like how to use their PPE, et cetera. But again, for the most part, Rangers are pretty happy that they were involved in this process. Rangers were deployed, activated in 2 CRPG across 4 CRPG, so the provincial Norths. And in 1 CRPG, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon, they were actually put on standby for the entire summer. So not all of them, right? But select members in each community, which means that they were actually being paid full time as Rangers throughout the summer, so that they would not go hunting, not go out on the land. They would stay in the communities in case they were needed. So the stories I'm hearing so far are very positive about the role that they were allowed to play and permitted to play, but also technical issues as well, right? As political, right? That intergovernmental relations and interdepartmental whole government approaches, those are hard to do. And so there was, I think, some pushback in terms of people not understanding what the roles and responsibilities of the Rangers are, what they can and cannot do. So that all had to be ironed out in those really early days in April and May, absolutely.
Yes, one of the things I've realized is that the military doesn't always want to advertise what they can and cannot do, because if they really tell everybody what they can do, they got asked to do more. And they'd rather do what they think is their job, but not much more than that. So that way they can save their resources and time because they're being stretched. And I imagine that that's the same as true up north.
And I will say, that's also one of the perks to the Rangers is that, there is pushback against, an increasing CAF role in domestic operations. But like Fort Vermilion, for instance, if the Ranger Patrol had not been there, would a military contingent have had to have been deployed? Same with a lot of the COVID-19 response in various communities across the country. So in that way, they're a force multiplier that is perhaps kind of alleviating the CAF of some of those responsibilities that are growing in terms of domestic and emergency operations.
Thank you. Back to Dr. Brown, or almost Dr. Brown. I'm curious as to, you're teaching these issues, but they're always live issues, but they become much more livelier the past few months. And I'm curious as to whether watching one CDS retire and then be embarrassed, and then a second CDS have to stand aside, has that led to more engagement by people who might have been critical? Or, I'm sure curious as to how it has affected your courses with the senior officers. I
think what I've experienced with the current JCSP course is that it's validating for those who have been expressing these kinds of concerns throughout their whole course. It actually has given a platform for people to be more vulnerable within the learning environment and the learning experience, to say, I share in this position as someone who's been thinking about the gray in my actions, or someone who's experienced these kinds of violations, and then dealing with the policy that is currently still ongoing within the Canadian Armed Forces of duty to report. And so I'd like to flag a really great response by my colleague, Dr. Alan Okras, is, in a lot of the conversations that the JCSP students are having about Operation Honor, they're coming forward with the duty to respond, which is a different framework entirely. And it's basing our consideration of military culture, military identity, and the intersectional perspectives that create and construct those identities as central to our understanding of how to go ahead with culture change, and how to really create a dialogue about the path forward, and also how to create some broader understanding about the different kinds of positions and social orders that are constructed within the military, and how those can relate to things like sexual exploitation and abuse, as well as sexual and gender-based violence.
Fantastic. I've been picking up on Okris's duty to respond as well, and I definitely think that that's the way forward on these issues. We've reached 3 o'clock, which means we're taking a half-hour break. But before we do so, I want to thank Ozan for his introductions, and I want to thank the 4 panelists for very interesting presentations. They all represent really important issues that we're all struggling with in some ways. Some things are going better than others. And I think through this kind of research, we're learning how we can make the Canadian Armed Forces and other security organizations more productive, functional organizations that will ultimately make them not just more effective, but better representations of what we want Canada to be. So I want to thank you, all 4 of you. I wish that we could be together, and someday we will be. And thanks again for representing your organizations quite well in today, as you did when you presented your research originally at the various events that were across Canada. So Linna, Peter, Stephanie, and Vanessa, thank you very much. And good luck with completing your research. And for those of you who are working on their dissertations, completing your dissertations as well. And we look forward to seeing you at future CDSN events down the road. For those in the audience, we'll be seeing you in a half an hour with the second panel of 3 presenters. So come back here at 3:30 Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you very much.